We're here at Entry 20, which covers Tuesday, April 14th and Friday, April 17th. And this is a big entry because you've now made your trip to Mexico City. Do you have any introductory thoughts before we talk about this in some more detail?
The first question that always gets asked is, why was I on the team that went to Mexico City? This was the area, of course, that Bill Coleman and David Slauson were working on. And they were the ones who were shaping the nature and agenda for the trip. It followed up on the suggestion from the CIA that we visit and talk to the people on the ground in Mexico City who had conducted what investigation there was about Oswald's visit to the city. I was on the delegation because I think Mr. Rankin wanted me to go, and because I was a representative of the Justice Department. And so there was a view that having someone on the delegation who was actually on the payroll of the Justice Department would help encourage agents from the FBI and the CIA to cooperate. Not that I brought a lot of prestige to the mission, but it simply seemed to be a useful thing to do. And I think David and Bill Coleman were receptive to that.
And it looked better to the Mexican authorities to have a government official there?
I think that's true. And interestingly, there was some talk in advance, I guess, from the State Department about how we might conduct ourselves without being identified as representing the Warren Commission. And I sort of thought that was an improbable course and impossible to achieve. And my thoughts along that line were vindicated by a development as we landed in Mexico City and were being processed or admitted into the country. In the course of that, some question was raised about the medical history of Bill Coleman, in particular vaccinations of some kind. And a Eastern airline official hustled over to the Mexican authorities and said, "Hold on here, this is Mr. Coleman representing the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy." The sentence was overheard, I'm sure, by more than one reporter, and so the newspapers carried the fact of our arrival shortly thereafter. That public release was a surprise to the State Department, and they were immediately on the phone to the embassy in Mexico City trying to get some explanation as to why this disclosure had been made. And I had to assure the people in the embassy that there was no ill done by the fact of this disclosure, and we were going to go on our work forward without any problem.
I know that as part of your visit, you took like a car tour of the different sites that Oswald was at. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, that's right. We did take a short site. I forget whether it was the FBI people who hustled us away. There were a handful of FBI people that we met immediately, and also a number of CIA people. We had individual meetings with those offices to find out what they knew, what they had done, and to bring them up to date on what we knew. But one thing they all agreed was that at least we ought to familiarize ourselves with where Oswald stayed, his hotel. We ought to drive by the Cuban consulate, and we ought to drive by the Soviet consulate as well. And I don't know, there were many other locations where we knew he had been. I guess we took a look at the restaurant where he reportedly ate on a regular basis. And that was about the extent of a tour, but it was, quite useful to acclimate ourselves to the city and get some sense of how he wandered around, because we looked at the public transportation that he might have used. I forget whether it was streetcars or buses, but we tried to trace and explore how he might have gone from the hotel to the embassies, where he spent most of his time trying to achieve his goal of getting what was called a transit visa to Cuba, and perhaps through Cuba to go on to Russia. And as you know, the Cuban embassy, there was some difficulty because they could not provide a transit visa until he had gotten a visa from the Soviet Union, which prompted him to visit the Soviet Union and produce the kinds of exchanges that I've discussed in the book and were discussed in the Warren Commission report.
The FBI withheld something from you here as well, and I want to point this out. I'm reading from page 155 of your book. The FBI also did not tell us that it learned on October 22nd of Oswald's activities in Mexico City and his contact at the Soviet embassy there with Vice Consul Valery Kostikov. The FBI's Soviet experts believe that Kostikov was an agent in the KGB department that carried out assassination and sabotage. That's quite a dramatic revelation that we have here, and of course much has been made of this by the research community in the years since. FBI didn't tell you about it. How do you feel today?
Well, actually, I feel that it's been seriously overblown because, and I'm comforted in that because of the disclosures that were made 30 or 40 years later, whatever it was, in the late 1990s, that it was simply a coincidence that this particular KGB official was at the embassy of the consulate, I forget which, when Oswald came in to pursue his demand, a request to have a visa. And the ultimate records, internal records of the KGB show that they thought he was a really strange person, and there were some encounters about a weapon, as I recall, being disclosed, and they were shocked to see him with a weapon. So in my view, it was a coincidence. It prompted a lot of speculation, of course, under the circumstances. But there really was nothing in the actual dealings with the Soviet Union representatives that was anything out of the ordinary. And all these conversations were overheard through listening devices and telephone wiretaps. So we're quite comfortable in the knowledge that we had and that the agencies provided about what actually transpired in these visits. And the most important disclosures, in my opinion, are those that happened with Sylvia Duran and her boss at the Cuban consulate. Oswald had difficulty with the languages, but eventually communicated his goal to Sylvia Duran, and she was sympathetic, but finally had to advise him that it simply was not possible to achieve his goal of getting a transit visa. He reacted in a very strong, offensive manner and generated enough of a dispute that the consulate official supervising Ms. Duran came forward and tried to placate him, but basically was on the verge of throwing him out of the consulate because of his ill manners and his anger and threats. So Oswald's impression on Mrs. Duran, was married at the time, was scarcely of a nature that would suggest that she wanted to have a social relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald, as has been subsequently alleged and chatted about.
Considering the very small amount of time, ostensibly, that Sylvia Duran had contact with Oswald, she has become this very significant figure in the assassination lore. There has been an accusation that when she was interrogated by Mexican officials that there was torture applied, or at least she was under some duress. Give us a sense of how the commission treated her and ultimately did not bring her in to testify.
Yeah, that was quite a sensitive subject for us. What's not recognized today is that relations with Mexico in the early 1960s were somewhat complicated because of the authoritarian nature of the government in Mexico City, and it's quite dislike of the Communist Party activities in the community. So we did see, and we were provided with a report of the interrogation of Ms. Duran by the Interior Department in Mexico City. And our one visit with an official was with the minister in charge of that. In the course of that discussion, we pursued the goal of trying to interview Ms. Duran herself. And we proposed a variety of ways to do it. And basically, after some dilatory conversation, the minister declined to give us permission to interrogate a Mexican citizen as part of a United States investigation on Mexican soil. So it was a matter of preserving the sovereignty of the country and not wanting to appear to be subject to the wishes of the United States government, even on this important matter. So it was complicated by the fact that her husband was an active member of the Communist Party, and it was unclear exactly what her political affiliations were. But when we returned to the United States after that trip, we did raise with the Chief Justice in Rankin whether we might invite her to and her husband to come to the United States, and they were initially not willing to do so. But after we returned from the Mexican trip, we received word from the CIA maybe a month or so later that they had changed their mind and were willing to come if they were invited. And that prompted a considerable amount of discussion within the staff and with the Chief Justice, and ultimately he declined to authorize that invitation because he was concerned by their integrity and the risk associated with bringing them to the United States because one really had no control over what they might say and do in the United States. And so it was decided not to invite them. I think in retrospect it would have been strategically useful to invite them, but it did carry with it some risk, so it was not done. What persuades me now, looking back and when I wrote the book, was that the situation in Mexico City was looked at with considerably more detail by the House Select Committee on Assassinations 15 years or so later. Their members of the congressional staff went to interview her. They produced an 100-page transcript, which I read in the course of writing the book, and it did not make any more admissions about her relationship, and in substance did not really vary on important issues from what we had learned from the report provided to us by the Mexican government. So many of the allegations about Duran and her activities and her possible relationship with Oswald were explored in considerable detail in a much different political environment 15 years later than we had been able to do. Relations with Mexico and the United States in the 1970s were much more amicable and cooperative than they had been during the time of the Warren Commission. So they also were able to look at the identity of the Soviet agents who met with Oswald at the Russian consulate, and they were able to make their own judgment as to whether there was anything there that's provided meaningful leads towards some kind of a conspiracy, and they concluded that there was no evidence of any foreign conspiracy involving the Soviet Union or Cuba.
Vincent Bugliosi does a really good job, I think, in his huge book, Reclaiming History. He gives almost a word-by-word, rundown, a reenactment of Oswald's time in the Soviet embassy and what was discussed, and the issue with the weapon, Oswald having a weapon that you mentioned. It really, the way Bugliosi presents it, it shows Oswald to be a fairly unstable person. At least that was the indication that the Soviet consulate got, that he was not quite all there, and so it certainly ties in with everything else that you were doing in Mexico City, that characterization of Oswald. This is a good moment to ask you about the alleged secret meeting that took place aboard a yacht with Fidel Castro during the time of the commission. This is Bill Coleman allegedly meeting with Castro aboard a yacht, something that you were apparently not aware of.
Yes, I've never heard of such a visit until many decades after the commission completed its work, and many years after the House Select Committee conducted its investigation, if I'm correct in that regard. So it was something that emerged actually in the years when Bill Coleman was writing his book about his years at the bar and in various governmental positions. My view is that the Chief Justice did not and never would have authorized a visit of Bill Coleman or any other representative on the part of the commission to go to Cuba for any purpose whatsoever. And the Chief Justice had very strong views with respect to the inability to rely on information supplied by the Cuban government. There would have been, Bill Coleman and no one else could have gone on behalf of the commission without the approval of the Chief Justice. Any such a meeting would have required a presidential approval, and it would have required a utilization of the resources of the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense would never have made vehicles, boats, or other planes available for this kind of a meeting with the premier of Cuba without a presidential approval and documentation. So I do not think that there was any such visit during the life of the commission. That is not to say there might not have been such a visit years later. It might have been that once the president learned in 1967 of the assassination plots of the CIA, that maybe the president, who then had a conversation with the Chief Justice, might have decided it would be useful to send someone to visit with Mr. Castro, and Bill Coleman would have been a likely candidate. But again, I do not think there are records of any kind supporting that visit. And so, but I'm concerned only with what happened during the work of the commission and have no special information with respect to events that might have occurred later.
I think in wrapping up, you do a very good job in this first paragraph of explaining that the trip was satisfactory. You sort of list three different things. I don't know if you want to read that section into the record, but I think that pretty much summarizes what you accomplished about halfway through that first paragraph. In short, we told Mr. Rankin. If you want to read that section to the end of that paragraph, that might be good.
When we returned from the visit, David Slauson prepared and Bill edited a very detailed memorandum, 50, 60 pages, about the trip and what we learned. One of the things we were able to do in Mexico City was bring the officials there in both the CIA and the FBI up to date on what the commission had learned. What was interesting to us was that some of the offices in Mexico City did not have all the information that their home offices had, and to some extent that complicated their assignment of investigating allegations that had come to our attention about misconduct or possible conspiratorial meetings involving Oswald. And so one of the purposes of the visit was to exchange information and then to pursue specific allegations. And we had at least 3 allegations that remained unclear when we visited in Mexico City, and we were able to bring somewhat more clarity and develop enough information on those to be able to reasonably conclude that they were not probative or significant in any way with respect to possible conspiracy. So with that background, when we came home, the voluminous and detailed memo was available, but for purposes of advising the Chief Justice, I said the trip was very satisfactory, and then a quote, 1, clarified certain facts which had not been adequately relayed to the Commission regarding certain of Oswald's activities in Mexico City. 2, enabled the Commission to request from the Mexican government a report of its investigative activity on this matter. And 3, permitted sufficient contacts for frank and detailed discussions with American representatives abroad so that the Commission is in a better position to make an informed judgment on this matter than it otherwise would have had. End of quotation. Now, no matter what we were able to learn, we never were able to, and no one else has been able to, document how he spent the hours when he wasn't sleeping in the hotel. And we had certain indications that he might have gone to a museum or seen a bull. What do they call them?
Like a bullfight,
a bull fight. But it is unclear. We had some information that he ate usually alone in a nearby restaurant, but we do not know when he went to bed late. He was not a drinker, actually, and Marina Oswald was surprised at one point when she was asked by members of staff of the commission about reports that he had been seen at a bar. And I think the fact that he did not drink is interesting, because it suggests that also there was no evidence of his being a party person in any way. So some of the allegations seem very hard to reconcile with the personality that unfolds as we conducted the investigation and looked at his background and his relationships from his youth through his marriage with Marina. I think that the fact that there are these allegations, and I think you know that with respect to the specific allegations of partying and relationship, that they were being expounded on and advocated by two women, one of whom I think was related in some way to Mr. Rand, maybe a cousin or sister-in-law or something of that sort. In any event, I understood that the House Select Committee invited these two women to appear before them, and indeed provided airplane tickets from Europe for that purpose, and they declined to appear. Mm-hmm. And I think the failure to appear to testify under oath about allegations goes a long way in suggesting that these were not really truthful allegations. But that's my view, and I'm sure it's not shared by many in the research community.
And Duran has always vehemently denied that there was any impropriety in her relationship with Oswald. Not that there was a relationship exactly. She only, encountered him there in the consulate. But.
Right, and she was encountered, as we know, by a well-known author of a book about this period of time. And he encountered her when she was at 76 years old, was returning from a grocery store with her arms full of grocery packages. And he confronted her and asked her to concede that she was, in fact, had an affair with Lee Harvey Oswald, and she smiled politely and went on to discharge her groceries and denied the allegation face-to-face with this prominent author.
A researcher once told me, if there are no pictures of Oswald in Mexico City, you can never prove that he was in Mexico City. And I suppose with an attitude like that, there's just no way of winning this particular argument. But it certainly seems like in the short time you were there, April 8th to the 13th, that you did a pretty good job of running down whatever information was there. Is there anything else about the trip to Mexico City that we haven't talked about? Because I know that this is an important moment in your work with the commission.
Well, I think that there's some uncertainty about. I think Mr. Scott may have been the head of the CIA office, and there's a report that I saw in some subsequent discussion that upon his death, Mr. Angleton immediately proceeded to fly to Mexico City to take charge of the records that Scott had generated and left with his wife. And Mr. Scott, among many others, was writing a book about his experience in the CIA, or perhaps it was fictional and rather than non-fictional. And in any event, anything that Angleton engaged in was immediately subject to conspiratorial implications and storylines, and so his visit certainly has fueled the suggestion that the CIA knew more about what Oswald did than, in fact, has ever seen the light of day. And it's unclear what they might have done, but it's part and parcel of the argument within the research community that the CIA might at some point have employed Oswald as an agent or had information about him that has never been revealed. So that's one aspect of it. But otherwise, I and David and Bill, I think, were impressed by the candor and the ability of the representatives of the FBI and the CIA there, and felt that they welcomed our trip and were eager to contribute what they could.